Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
It's June 22nd, and we're on episode 55 of Transmission.
Woohoo!
I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert, and I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And I was thinking we haven't talked about money in a long time. I think we did like once
Did we
way
talk
back,
about-
and once in like episode 20 or something. Or
Remember back in those days,
back in the day,
we had a devil may care attitude, and
That's
just
right.
only our hopes to guide us.
So I thought I would just throw that out again. So MICA pays for transmission. It's not very expensive, but there are a few costs involved. And this has been helpful to you on the Transmission Facebook page. I've got the link where you can donate to MICA, and you can throw us, I don't know, $31 million or something. That would be good.
Yeah, don't be greedy. I don't know.
Don't be greedy.
I think you should settle for 20 million, and anything above 20 million can go to the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
There we go.
Is that a deal?
That's a deal.
Okay.
That's a deal.
Bring it in.
Yeah. I'd actually settle for like $5 at this point. It would be awesome.
That leads me to maybe in the future we should talk about the influx of money that came into the Twin Cities and what that means for nonprofits. But I don't know if that's in the wheel. We can talk about that later. But today we're talking about this narrative of that the United States has given up on the pandemic.
Right. So we're hearing this all the time, and and certainly for those of us who live in the United States, it is kind of what it looks like, right? I mean, that phrase does fit our experience. We see people out and about all the time. I think I mentioned I was up in Northwest Minnesota. There's no way you could tell that there was a pandemic. We've got Trump voters burning their masks on YouTube. People just out and about, everything opening. I love when you hear in the news, there'll be these lines like, yesterday, Texas had its highest number of new hospitalizations for coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
Next week, they further their opening up schedule, right? So it's sort of this total disconnect between what's going on with the pandemic and what people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a phrase that may look good or sound good, but I don't actually think it's the correct phrasing.
No, part of this ties into our conversations recently about systemic versus personal. I feel like when you start saying we've given up, that's kind of a moral argument based upon the character of a people. If you talk about the ways that we're fucked up, which is how we're kind of pitting against like what is systemically going on, then it's like, well, no, there's just something about the way our society is structured and its dominant narratives and how leadership functions that is creating this. So it's not like, it's not that we're somehow innately stupider than other societies.
Well, right. Or that, what the phrase giving up implies is that if you sort of had some will or you kind of wanted to, you could like turn it around and not give up.
Yeah, all we need is that can-do spirit, like Rosie the Riveter.
Yeah. And part of what I think is important to really lift up is that it's actually not that we've given up. It's that, there is this stew of systemic realities that is actually preventing us from doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny, particularly within the medical world, to watch some of the reactions of foreign physicians.
Mm-hmm.
My wife Deborah is on all these doctor Facebook groups. They're talking to people, talking to each other all the time. There have been a couple of articles written, and some of these particularly European physicians are looking at America and just like going, what is the problem here? Like we're confused. We don't understand, why are you dealing with this so badly? Particularly and there was one German physician commenting on this, I think yesterday or the day before, saying, like, I learned all of the epidemiological techniques that we are applying in Germany. I learned them all in the United States. And so why aren't you guys doing what we know how to do to help with this? And again, I think that the issue is that we are in this time of major crisis of leadership combined with these historical realities of racism and toxic theology that has actually created the conditions under which we can't deal with this.
Yes. Quick comment from Gus. There are some people who believe in robot birds. We might just be innately stupid. Fair counterpoint.
Hey, Gus, robot birds are real.
It's interesting, like going back to earlier, so this weekend I went out to the suburbs to go to Total Wine. And I was surprised, like just a few miles out of the city, I went from everyone in the Minneapolis wearing a mask inside buildings to half inside Total Wine. And then for Father's Day, we went down to Faribault and some other of the small towns on there and went into places and nobody had masks. So there's that effect. And seeing that and noticing like, okay, this has been months dragging on. School's starting in the fall. We have a vague sense there's more testing. That's about it. There's no sense of clear plan. You can't trust in leadership. Personally, I feel like, well, there's nothing for me to really rely on, and I don't want to live the rest of my life indoors while our society at large is not doing anything about it. So it's easy for me to kind of give up, but it's because of these systemic realities. Like there's no reason we couldn't have taken this on more directly in a much more confident, positive way. So instead we're like, it's not like people don't all see the same information. Every chart shows that we don't have a wave. We went up to a plateau and it's kind of slowly declining, and that all the models I've seen that are worth anything show like sometime around August, it'll peak back up. So instead of having a second wave, we're just having just one gigantic tsunami.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's already going back up. I mean, if you look at the graph of new daily cases, United States wide, we went down a little bit and now it's starting to climb again. And interestingly, the places where it is doing worst is in so-called red states. The place where it is doing best are in so-called blue states. It is by far doing worse across the South than it is in the North and the West. And again, these are not coincidences. This isn't like some magical, by chance. This really has a lot to do with, again, what are the things that have formed people in those places and those societies that then cause them to respond in this particular way.
Well, there's a whole slew of complex things that kind of overlap. So I feel like one of the things that's easy to do in moments like this is to have an overly simple narrative that is just like Trump supporters don't care, which there's something to that. There's also the way in which how medical systems in rural America have been gutted. And, I remember back when Bernie Sanders was pushing this idea of municipal hospitals in rural areas, and how everyone's like that would have, if we had that, we would have been much better equipped to respond to this. Things like that, how white supremacist logic works, all kinds of things, how we treat our old, just everything we've talked about for 54 episodes has brought us to this point where we just lack the capacity even to respond to this anymore. Steries writes, our leadership dumped the pandemic manual.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it actually literally did.
Literally, yes.
And, what's been very interesting to me is that my sister-in-law actually helped to write the pandemic manual. So she was in the CDC in charge of pandemic type things, worked on Ebola, worked on Zika virus, and she and a number of colleagues wrote this pandemic manual that that again, and created this team that Trump dismissed and disbanded. And that's why, again, a lot of these international doctors who know all the same people, right? I mean, they all run in the same professional circles, and they're just kind of going like, what is happening here? We're really confused. We got more comments.
Yeah, this is, hey, can you discuss the dashboard illustration you posted, please, from slavery through to, I mean, this maybe, I think I know what you're talking about. I can share that. This connects, I don't know if this connects directly, but we can maybe just talk for a couple seconds about that. Do you know what he's talking about, Dan?
Yep,
okay,
I do. No, I think it does connect.
Real quick.
I think it does connect.
Okay, so let's see if this is it. Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
So this is a thing I tweaked because it shows 246 years of American slavery leading to segregation, and the usual version of this chart then shows like basically modern times, and so as though somehow segregation was not long ago, so we should have perspective. But I added the fact that we only had 14 years of what we consider the civil rights era. And that was almost entirely due to white backlash pushed back against in this era of mass incarceration. Just like segregation and our Jim Crow laws were a white backlash to the Civil War and the era of Reconstruction. So we live in a time since 1970 where there's been increasing mass incarceration. We blame Reagan, but every Democratic president has also been complicit in this since the 70s, this kind of war on drugs narrative. Mm-hmm. And so we find ways still to systematize our racism while at the same time spinning these lies that somehow we're always becoming ever freer as a society. Mm-hmm. So that's partly how white supremacist logic works.
Right. Yeah. And then, as Gene put up there, I mean, one of the ways that this connects, right, is that part of what has kept whiteness rolling and part of the whole American mythology is an ability to forget this chart, right? Mm-hmm. So this total kind of denial of what our history is like. And we're just able to sort of tune the whole thing out. And so in the same way, when something like the pandemic comes along, we're literally able to tune it out. I mean, just this morning, and I believe it's the head of the faculty of SMU, which is a university down in Texas, interestingly tied, it's Southern Methodist University, right? So it's tied to the Methodist Church, which is very much a part of white supremacy in the South in particular. Comes out and basically says, oh, the pandemic isn't deadly. COVID isn't deadly. We can just start class again. Right? And it's exactly that same thing. It's like, oh, slavery didn't happen. We didn't kill 10 million Africans. Like, that just didn't happen. The South was nice, right? The Confederacy was nice. It was just about states' rights and, our great heritage. And so it's exactly that same, again, that formation that we as white people are formed to forget and to pay attention. And if anything threatens us in that particular way, we just say, no, it's not real. It doesn't exist.
Well, or even if it was bad, things aren't that bad anymore. I read an article about the current tsunami, talking about back in the day before we had modern awareness of medicine, plagues would last. There'd be little peaks every decade or so, but it would take hundreds of years. There'd be a huge exponential growth, and then it would take just decades for it to slowly dissipate. But now we expect waves because we know we can combat medicine. So I think we take for granted that we'll be able, it's part of this myth of progress. It's like why we're not, so many people aren't really that concerned about climate change is because somehow Elon Musk is going to take us to Mars, which is the most stupid logic ever. Let's move it, instead of this habitable planet that needs a little bit of help, let's move to an entirely desolate place and create utopia there. It's this trust in these narratives that somehow progress will always prevail. Greg wrote, yes, it connects denial of reality. You're talking about that. There's this somehow this incapacity or incapability of looking at reality. Instead, we just let these narratives pull us along. Ceres writes, it's also the horror reality of living in a eugenic society.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. So some people are just disposable, and if you're not suffering, then it's okay because you're one of the necessary people.
Yeah.
Jeremy writes, we have one of the highest infection rates in the state of Indiana. I've been seeing that. It's been a little frustrating. Our commissioners this morning said that they will not mandate masks because it is unenforceable, and that it will actually cause an angry reaction resulting in less mask wearing than is currently happening.
Right. Yeah. And again, this is part of kind of acknowledging, although they're not stating it frankly, but this is acknowledging these formational psychic ways that, white people are malformed, right? It and stuck in this. I mean, I say teenager when I said that once a couple months back. Somebody said, no, it's really closer to a toddler. But right, as soon as somebody tells me what to do, even if it's absolutely for my own good and for the good of others, I'm just going to not do it so that I can be free. And I'm going to sort of puff up my chest and parade around in my freedom.
Yeehaw.
Yeehaw. All right, the comments are coming in. Let's keep rolling.
Yeah. Toxic spirituality, systematized racism. Yeah, I would love to see more, theology students, even though the humanities are being depleted and more expensive every day. Seminaries are closing. But to me, the theology, what is it about even American Christianity that is prone towards systemic racism? There's already been work on it, but in light of this pandemic, it's just a lot of nerdy research to be had. Kathleen writes, this is a brain condition called preservation. Or there is a brain condition called preservation where people get stuck in illogical patterns of behavior, even if the resulting actions are dangerous. I feel like our country has gotten stuck in patterns of behavior that are not helpful.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different ways of characterizing that. I think people are much more familiar with this term denial. But and Ceres has mentioned this a number of times too. We've talked about it. It's also this dissociative quality, right? Where you just check out from your embodiment and social embodiment, and you just pretend that that a certain thing doesn't exist.
Well, and part of how whiteness works is this buffer, same as middle classness, so that the ill effects of all this stuff don't immediately press upon you. And then, of course, this is where scapegoating comes in. If you start struggling, then you just blame someone else. So it's the perfect cocktail for denialism that will ultimately almost always lead to some sort of fascism, which is what we're seeing right now. Catherine writes, another white supremacist message is literally slavery isn't deadly. It's not that bad, is a common theme and tactic with a lot of these racist narratives.
Yeah.
This is the downplaying of slavery. A lot of people don't believe me when I talk about this because I've met a number of people in kind of liberal bubbles that don't get how routinely slavery is minimized in all sorts of places, not just the South.
Yeah.
Like no one says slavery. Hardly anyone. Some people will. Hardly anyone says slavery is good, but tons of people say it wasn't as bad as we make it out to be.
Right.
It's kind of like the Holocaust denialism of American society.
Yep.
Gene writes, in slavery, commodified the money made off black-brown. When slavery was illegal, then no genuine interest to care for health of black or brown bodies because it cannot make money off them anymore. Mm-hmm. There's a whole set of intersecting ideologies in that. But yeah, mass incarceration, the idea of exploitation of labor, mixed with how our health care system is economically driven. We're really not in a good situation as a society to deal with the crises we find ourselves in.
No,
but you know what?
Not at all.
Hey, you know what though, Dan? Joe Biden's going to fix it. You can only laugh when it's all you can do at this point. It's either laugh or cry.
I got nothing.
I don't know which Gene is mentions a Yale open course that's free to all. I'm assuming around this theme of slavery and history. So yeah, check it out. Google that. I've never checked out a Yale open course, but free knowledge is good.
He's got it a little later here in African American Studies from Slavery to the Present. Yeah. No.
Yeah, and also just to throw onto that, the documentary, like I'm astonished at how few people have seen it. The documentary on Reconstruction is eye-opening. If you watch that and then watch DuVernay's 13th documentary, it really sets things up well for our current situation. Gary writes, I'm a Franciscan with the Indigenous Anglican Church in Canada, and we're tying the two racism together. People on reserves here are terrified of COVID and feel threatened by the growing laxness.
Yeah. Well, and Gary, we're getting that down here. I mean, the Navajo Nation, which intersects Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, is one of the hardest hit places in the United States, and and the governors of those states have actively been trying to undermine the measures that the heads of the Navajo reservation lands are trying to put into place, and telling them they can't do certain things. And the same thing happened in South Dakota, where a couple of the tribes wanted to put up some roadblocks to restrict access to the reservation. Because they have basically no health care there, and they're way out in the middle of nowhere. And, the South Dakota governor just went to battle with them against doing that. I actually don't know what the status of that. I sort of stopped following that a while back. But yeah, no, I mean, it's exactly the same kind of thing. And again, part of what this sort of activates in all of these white people and communities is this thing of we have to pretend that it doesn't exist and it's not that bad.
Well, and then I'd be curious if anybody could post any updates on this. My understanding was that the Trump administration blocked funds that was supposed to go to reservations and indigenous groups for stimulus and COVID support, and $0 of it got to them until I don't know if it's a federal circuit court said you have to give them this money. I don't know if it's been released yet, but if you didn't know better, you'd think United States government is genocidal in its relationship with indigenous people. There's sarcasm there.
Yeah. We weren't catching that over the airwaves. Kathleen's got a comment.
A lot of my church members insist that since they never owned slaves, this is not their fault, not their problem. I'm okay with saying not their fault, but it's definitely all of our problem as white Americans.
Yeah, and again, that's so plug in the systems class. That's another great example of the individualistic versus systemic thinking, right? And in individualistic thinking, if I haven't done something or directly participated in something, I am totally disconnected from it. I have nothing to do with it. Doesn't have any influence on me. Doesn't help me or harm me. Because my life is only about things that I do or don't do. And that's nonsense, but it's a very powerful view of reality.
It's astonishing to me, speaking theologically, that a group of people who are so individualistically minded can also at the same time have any meaningful way of saying Jesus Christ died on the cross for our collective sins. Like, that doesn't make, you know what I mean? Like, that's why it always gets bogged down in kind of weird magics instead of like understanding any deep meaning of the cross as an act of solidarity and transformation at all. Because it's just about like him just like absorbing the sins of the world and then dying with them or something in some sort of weird arcane magical ritual.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, that's a great point, right? Because then we've talked about this individualistic theology, right? So you kind of have this image of Jesus on the cross and like everybody just individually, relating to him. Yeah, and
That's
it's
right.
almost as if he died like 7 billion times over and over again for each individual, and there's no collectivity to it at all.
Well, then this is where you get the Sunday school version and its flip side, which is like, even if it was just you, Jesus would have died, which I always heard as Jesus died all because of you. It's like, wow.
Yeah. No.
Gene writes, COVID impacted Montreal, also an indicator of race and class in Canada. I'm not familiar much with Montreal, so I would love to hear more about that. I can guess, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. So what, so again, what is, kind of fascinating to me about all of this as well, another angle that this ties into is this relationship with science, right? Which is directly connected to all of this toxic theology. And again, there is no coincidence that this pandemic is going worse in the South than other places, right? Because that's also the place of the most science denial. We saw this playing out with this whole rally in Tulsa, right? I mean, you had basically every medical person in the state, pleading with Trump and with the GOP and with the governor and with the mayor to not do this thing, right? And just saying like, you are setting up and creating this public health disaster. And basically everybody was just like, well, that's your opinion, but no, we're not gonna listen to that. We're not gonna do that. And so again, that's why when I say that given up is really the wrong phraseology to this. I mean, this is not about giving up. This is about an active system that is forcing us to not do the things that we need to do. And and in some ways, right, from the pandemic perspective, thank God only 6,200 people went to this thing. Because if it was 100,000 between indoors and outdoors, it would have been way worse. But, that's still potentially a huge number of cases, right, that are going to be in Oklahoma, are going to be exported to other states. 5 minutes before the thing or a few hours before the thing, we find out that, 6 staffers have tested positive who've been working on this. So it's quite possible that this entire arena was just full of COVID virus floating around everywhere. And it's on a certain level, it really is, almost clinically insane. But it very much is a function of all of these different issues.
I wonder if anybody there, do you think there's anybody in the crowd who was wearing a mask?
In the pictures I saw, I did see one picture of this one guy like sitting up in the rafters, like second or third row from the top, all by himself wearing a mask. That was the only person I saw.
It's probably a reporter for a small town newspaper.
Yeah, right.
Just got a couple minutes left, so get your comments in if you've got them. If you're lurking out there, Gene writes that Jesus was not white either. Walked around in the desert, probably dark skin, and got darker as he walked. Would probably be labeled as a person of color. Yeah, this is Jesus is. It's amazing how much we've made Jesus into the poster boy of white supremacy. It's disturbing because there's nothing white about it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most recent little memes that I saw about that was, Jesus saying, well, I was going to come back, but then I'm seeing how you're treating brown-skinned Palestinians, and I decided to stay away.
Gene also writes, his crucifixion was just another example of roadkill from systemic racism, no more important than all the names of the BLM movement. Yeah, Jesus was killed by a law and order administration to crack down on crime, like to restore order to a society. I mean, there's more to it than that, but there's not less to it than that. So I don't understand why people can't connect the dots a little bit more. Jesus illegally, and people always do theological stuff to get out of this. Like, yeah, Jesus, since the temple was, he's God, since the temple was him, it was okay for him to be disruptive. I'm like, no.
No.
You know what? Like, technically, all these people of color who have been killed by the police, mostly black men, but not just black men, they're taxpayers, so they own the streets that they were killed on. So they had just as much rights to be there as Jesus did in the temple, if you can use that logic. Somehow you're thinking Jesus is more like you than like them, and that's your problem. Adam, I knew you were lurking. You're always
yes.
It's wild to me that the exact same language is used for the normalization of death, murder of communities of color at the hands of the pandemic and the police. Quote, these communities have, or this person has pre-existing health conditions that lead to their death, end quote. Great observation. As he initially said about George Floyd, also applies to not just health conditions, but also moral conditions of criminality. And the same way we're pushed into normality with the pandemic is the same way we're forced to deal with, and that trails off. If we could say more, but yeah, I think it's not I don't think it's an accident. I think we generally do tend to think of even from a theological perspective, we think of disease and criminality both from the lens of being unclean. It's like a disgust mechanism. And so we want to like gate it off, and anything that purges it that doesn't hurt us is good. So this is the same thing that Jesus was directly confronting in his time with who is excluded, which was a kind of a tie-up of a health and a moral concern. And that same mechanism is still here in our society. We treat certain groups of people as unclean based upon the purity of whiteness. That's the kind of the counterexample. And it's disgusting, and it's literally dehumanizing.
Yeah. And totally all interconnected. And so just end on a comment from a friend of ours, Reverend Gregory Bentley, who was actually on our show early on,
somewhere in the 20s or 30s.
And Saturday night, he and Alana Street Stewart got elected as co-moderators of the National Presbyterian Church, PCUSA. Very exciting. Shout out to them. Congratulations. And one of the things I was talking to him this morning, and he said, these fundamentalist churches that want to come and pray with me over all this justice stuff, but continually want to dismiss the fact that COVID even exists. It's like, I'm not doing that. I'm not pretending, right? And so I think that I think that it's easier, it feels better to say we've given up, because again, that implies we could do something with it if we wanted to. I think it's far more terrifying, really, to realize how handicapped our society is. And again, this is something that is being revealed by the pandemic, by what happened with George Floyd, and all these other people who've been killed by the cops. And so to me, it's really a call to not only understand these things, but to really try to do something different. So wear your masks, be careful, and try to hack the robot birds so they can be on our side.
That's right. An army from the sky.
All right.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this earlier, Dan, but I'm not going to be able to be on tomorrow. So looks like.
Okay, so we won't be here tomorrow. We'll be back on Wednesday.
Yeah.
All right.
See you all on Wednesday.